Hello everyone, my name is Orsolya Lehotai and I'm currently a PhD student at the New School at the Politics Department. Today I will talk about the Hungarian government's responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I will explore a little bit the ways in which these governmental responses exposed fundamental problems about the state of contemporary Hungarian democracy. In February 2020, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán said, and I quote, "Even though the coronavirus attracts everyone's attention now, the historically relevant challenge today is migration." End of quote. COVID-19 has exposed longer-lasting political and institutional trends in Hungarian politics pertaining to exclusionary discourses on migration and the articulation of difference in relation to immigration. Orbán made his first official public statement regarding the looming pandemic in his usual Friday morning interview at Kossuth Radio. His weekly morning interviews at Kossuth Radio have become a very important mouthpiece of his ideology over the years. His initial statement evoked the now routine-like state-led narrative against migration and emphasized a certain kind of hierarchy of competing priorities of the state's attention at the time. As the public health crisis slowly unfolded in March, several public announcements and decisions were made in relation to closing down the borders to prevent illegal immigration. The Prime Minister's senior advisor on internal security, György Bakondi, reiterated the usual governmental rhetoric on migration when he said in March that Hungary would bar asylum seekers from entering the transit zones at its southern border. The governmental rhetoric about the looming health crisis and its efficiency in fear-mongering in the country at the time of uncertainty of the global pandemic cannot be separated from building upon its permanently articulated crisis of national borders in relation to immigration. The state-led discourses and actions to the COVID-19 crisis was intimately tied to other cycles of crisis rhetorics of contemporary Hungarian politics. And in relation to this, I will talk about contagious bodies and their connection to immigration in historically as well as contemporary exclusionary discourses. The Hungarian public has been conditioned since the 2015 refugee crisis to respond to governmental messages concerning the figure of the migrant. As a result of the pervasive state-led othering processes and different sets of exclusionary practices, by the time the coronavirus pandemic unfolded, a wide variety of racist narratives were readily available for the people to respond to them. In line with the Prime Minister's previous statement in the radio, György Bakondi made a clear connection between contagion and contagious bodies when he said, and I quote, "There's a certain relationship between coronavirus and illegal immigration," end of quote. This connection has been emphasized several times throughout March as part of the state's own dominant outbreak narrative, as Priscilla Wald calls this, to explain how the disease entered into Hungary, how it traveled internationally and globally, and how it could be contained. This narrative began with not only establishing the connection between immigration and communicable diseases in general, but specifically emphasizing that asylum seekers at Hungary's southern border are the carriers to blame, who had mainly come from Iran, which was one of the epicenters of the outbreak at the time. The language of biological contagion entered the well-established anti-foreigner public discourse as the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "We are facing an invisible and anonymous enemy," end of quote. The unregulated visibility of the virus has directed the government's long-standing anxiety around promoting a certain kind of normative sameness of ideal political subjects at ordering, confining, and eventually containing its unruly subjects. The containment of the virus narrative has been intimately tied together with containing the state's alleged enemy. As Orbán said in one of his usual morning radio interviews that I mentioned, and I quote, "There is an enemy here that we cannot defeat and destroy, so we have to live with it for now. Living with the enemy is not great. It has to be erased and stepped on, and when there is available vaccine, weapon, then we will impale this virus," end of quote. So the language of warfare has inextricably entered the linguistic fields of both crisis and their purported enemies, as well as the assumed overlap between those two. The government's seemingly abstract figure of the migrant was tailored to be used in a concrete case of legally residing foreign student visitors in relation to the outbreak narrative. So this outbreak narrative of the government has highly dependent on the years-long fear-mongering in relation to immigration. And it was strategically picked up to be used in this very particular case that I will talk about. The state's narrative continued with identifying and singling out two Iranian medical students returning to Budapest after the winter break who tested positive for COVID-19. In a few days, more students were identified from Iran with contact tracing who either tested positive for the coronavirus or were identified as being in contact with others who tested positive. And these students were obliged to stay and to be surveilled in a state-ordered quarantine in a separated public hospital room. As several journalists reported, some of the quarantined individuals were logged in together in the same room with a student who was known to have tested positive for the virus by the medical staff, but they were not provided with information about the student's COVID-19 status. It was reported that the medical staff specifically told the person who tested positive to not inform others who were staying in the same room about his status. As a result of these conditions, upon being informed about the circumstances, some of the students wanted to leave the quarantine room and demanded safer treatment by the medical professionals in the healthcare facility. Singling out Iranian students publicly took place during the daily coronavirus operative staff announcements, where the most pressing medical statistics, public health regulations, and changes of everyday policies were supposed to be shared with the public pertaining to the pandemic. These students were publicly targeted as the alleged sources of both the pandemic outbreak in Hungary as well as the unruly opponents of the state's unregulated measures of confinement. The ways in which state-led racism came about in this particular case fit very smoothly in the intensifying scapegoating practices of the government against both external and internal enemies. This public portrayal of contagious bodies was strategically conflated with the purported dangerousness of immigrant bodies. No one else has been reportedly singled out among those who violated the rules of state-ordered quarantine practices, even though there have been approximately 45,000 cases of people breaching these rules by the beginning of May. What allowed state authorities to construct the pandemic outbreak narrative so efficiently is that it has been in line with the state's fear-mongering communication practices during the past decade. The solidification of the state-led outbreak narrative was enabled by not only the majorly government-dominated public media practices of the ruling parties, but by the constant mediation of the government's measures on social media that has become a central daily routine of Hungarians. Throughout March and April, the Prime Minister's Facebook page has become one of the main and most popular sources of governmental public announcements. There were instances when there were more than 1 million spectators who were watching his live announcement simultaneously. Besides this wide outreach of Orban's social media announcements, he visibly took control over the outbreak narrative as well as part of the last frontiers of state capture of social means of communication. The governmental response to the pandemic and the uncertainty around the virus has not only personalized public actions of the state, but also contained in our newsfeed who can communicate publicly about the crisis and who cannot. The political communication machine has had a great role in naturalizing these public activities of the Prime Minister on an everyday basis. In tandem with the construction, mediation, and solidification of the state's racist outbreak narrative, the pandemic exposed the fundamental problems with the self-proclaimed illiberal tools of governance. The unfolding global public health crisis in the country exposed that the head of the government not only needed the one-time majority of the parliament to pass the um, special authorization bill in order to contain the personally established outbreak narrative among its ruling party members as well. When on May 1st, the Prime Minister said that the first battle against the coronavirus has been won, as the virus has become contained and the country is prepared to manage the pandemic, that also shed light on the government's overwhelming role in containing the potentially viral nature of dissent and difference, whether displayed as immigrant and non-normative bodies or as oppositional voices. Controlling the dominant narrative of winning the battle against the virus seems to be a core element of simultaneously legitimizing Orban's rule, whether by decree or without this special authorization. In this setup, the containment of the virus cannot be detached from the containment of the illiberal regime. This state-led narrative of the COVID-19 outbreak not only exposed the already existing frontiers as well as limits of democratic politics in the country, but it solidified these power relations through legitimizing restrictive measures in times of both assumed certainty and uncertainty. Meanwhile, a new bill was proposed by the Deputy Prime Minister on May 26 about ending the special authorization of the government on June 20th, while allowing the possibility of renewing this sweeping power without further parliamentary authorization at any time. This governmental move further blurs the lines between times of certainty and uncertainty, while it also reiterates the dangerous confusion between regulating and containing contagion and contagious bodies.